Welcome to Underworld UK, where Britain's darkest stories are brought to light. From the gritty streets of Gangland, London, Liverpool, Manchester and Birmingham, from Curtis Warren to the Cray twins to county lines and modern-day true crime, we cover everything. Bringing you new videos every week. Subscribe so that you'll be notified when the next video is put out.
Today we are looking at a man that divides opinion. Some people have nothing but praise, some people glad to see the back of him. So we're going to deep dive into the life of the one and only Lee Duffy. Here we go. Born in South Bank, Middlesbrough, Lee Duffy's story didn't begin with violence. It began with pain. Bullied from the age of 6, at 14 he was beaten unconscious. But instead of breaking him, it lit a fire. Lee threw himself into boxing. On senior nights, he knocked out older, heavier opponents, one after another. From that point on, he knew he could handle himself, and the streets began to take notice. Duffy left Stapleton School in 1981 with a CSE Grade 3 in woodwork. The following year, violence landed him in a detention centre for 6 months. Then, in April 1983, he was given a youth custody order lasting 2.5 years for attacking and robbing a nightclub doorman. Charges of affray and assault against Duffy were dropped in 1984 when no one would give evidence at court. 4 similar charges were dropped on separate occasions for the same reason. That year, Duffy met a single mother of one, Carol Bonnie Holmstrom, a South Bank girl 3 years older than him, and they began a turbulent 5-year relationship. Duffy was jailed in March 1988 for 4 years after pleading guilty to a vicious assault on a man in the Speakeasy nightclub, later the Havana, in Middlesbrough. The attack deprived his victim, Martin Clark, of an eye. While serving his sentence, Duffy was moved to 18 different prisons. When strip-searched during these moves, he became very aggressive. At each jail, he wanted to take over and be top man. In August 1988, while Duffy was behind bars, Bonnie gave birth to their second daughter, Michelle, and soon afterwards she told him that it was all over between them. However, on being released from prison in May 1990, Duffy visited Bonnie in hospital where she was being treated for stress. He broke down in tears and then went on holiday. On his return, he broke the news to Bonnie that Lisa Stockel was pregnant with his child. Duffy's childhood hero was another of Teesside's hard men, Kevin Ducko Duckling. He idolized the man and wanted to be like him when he got older. Duffy modeled himself on Ducko and similar hard men, and maybe this is what helped mold him into the man he eventually became. Although, as a family man, he was undoubtedly compassionate and cared about the 2 daughters he had with Bonnie and his daughter born to Lisa, Cattilay. In June 1988, Ducko was charged with manslaughter and given a 4-year prison sentence. He had shoved a partially disabled man from Sheffield, causing him to hit his head on the ground and die. The death of 21-year-old Paul Dalloway occurred at a blues party. These unlicensed gatherings, often organised and frequented by black people, sold alcohol and usually took place in terraced houses or disused commercial premises that had been converted in a rough-and-ready way. Once the pubs and clubs closed, people wanted the fun to go on. And that is how blues parties developed. At one time, some cans of booze and a few grams of white powder or cannabis would get things going. But then the parties became commercialized, and people started to make money out of running events where hundreds of paying guests would pack in. Curry and rice would be served, and drugs would be on sale to keep the party in full swing, while reggae tunes would blast out at full power. Usually an open fire was kept going to quickly burn drugs if the police raided. There would be plenty of prostitutes and illegal gambling on offer in the quieter rooms either upstairs or at the back of the house. Blues parties were very dangerous places where you could get stabbed or shot, but Duffy chose them as his hunting ground for rich pickings from drug dealers. Soon his reputation went before him and he was a force second to none in the Middlesbrough area. Just the mention of his name would make drug dealers run a mile. As he grew, so did his reputation. By his 20s, Lee was a one-man crime wave, 96 complaints to police in just 16 months. He became known as an enforcer, collecting debts, intimidating rivals, and running the streets of Teesside and Tyneside. In the pubs, they called him a Robin Hood. On police reports, he was a dangerous, unpredictable thug. But in his world, respect came at a cost. A look at Duffy's past will show that he was much more orientated towards violence than his Newcastle counterpart Viv Graham ever was, and because of this, he would receive a series of threats to his life. Back in the 1980s, when Duffy was in his early 20s, he thought he could use his boxing prowess to carve out a reasonable living from crime. For people who make a decision like this, crime becomes a normal, accepted way of life. Court appearances were an occupational hazard for Duffy, and by 1988, when he was sentenced to 4 years for affray by Teesside Crown Court, he had seen the inside of a court over a dozen times, and more than once in connection with charges of violent crime. But the streets started to fight back. No sooner was Duffy released from prison than he was in trouble again. This time, though, it was different. He was usually the one to dish out the punishment, but now he was on the other end of violence. The early hours of a December morning in 1990 saw the industrial district of Middlesbrough disturbed by the noise of a shotgun. In the typical Underworld way, Duffy had been shot in the knee. A man was later charged with the shooting, and because the damage was not as serious as it might have been, Duffy started to believe he was invincible. Over time, he was called many names because of his violent behaviour, thug being one of the milder ones. At the time of this assault on him, Duffy shared a home with his girlfriend, Lisa Stockel, in Eston. Gangsters of the old school tended to consider the home as a place of refuge, out of bounds for causing trouble, because innocent people could be hurt. The unwritten code of conduct that included this rule may have applied years ago, but it was certainly not observed by the 2 black men who came looking for Duffy. The 2 men who broke into the home of Lisa Stockel on the 31st of January 1991, she was 9 months pregnant at the time, were clearly expecting to find Duffy at home, as they had come tooled up. As usual, when cowards are given the job of real men, they had with them some equalizers in the form of a shotgun and a leg breaker, an iron bar. Not finding Duffy, these 2 hairy gorillas vented their frustration on the 4 people in the house, 3 women and 1 man. The intruders ripped gold rings from Lisa's fingers and threatened all sorts of things in their determination to know where her boyfriend was. Feeling full of themselves, they finally left in search of their intended victim. In the early hours of the morning, a time that he loved, Duffy was attending a blues party in a former wedding boutique in Harrington Road, Middlesbrough, unaware that his girlfriend, her sister, her mother, and another man had been the victims of 2 thugs earlier that night. When he heard what had happened, he was determined to seek out those responsible and got hold of photographs of the pair involved in the raid. Rumours have it that a police source passed them on to him. Soon afterwards, the 2 men who were on Duffy's trail turned up at the party and got into a fight with him. One of them pulled out a shotgun and leaned over the bar, pointing it at Duffy, who snatched the weapon, making it go off and blast his foot into a gory mess. He had to have skin grafts taken from his thigh to close up the hole in his foot. As a party piece, Duffy would show the sole of his foot, which still had pellets visibly embedded in it. In a similarly macabre stunt, when the gunman was on remand in prison, he came out of his cell during association, took a draw on a cigarette, blew the smoke into a trainer he had just taken off and asked people what it was. No one knew until he said, "Duffy's foot," after it was shot. Duffy must have been getting used to being shot at. Just over a month before that incident, he had been confronted by a gunman who made the first attempt to murder him. That night, 27th of December 1990, Duffy was called out from a club in Middlesbrough's Prince's Road, only to be forced to dive over a car for cover when he realised he was in danger. He escaped death, but was blasted in the knee with a shotgun. After spending 4 days in hospital, he signed himself out. From this first attack onwards, it was clear that there was a violent campaign to take Duffy off the scene in Middlesbrough by killing him. Because of his stand against drugs on his territory, dealers were losing a lot of money. His situation mirrored Viv Graham's in Newcastle. where his life too was under threat because he was stopping a lot of dealing going on. In Duffy's case, no fewer than 10 men faced charges of attempting to murder him relating to 3 different incidents. All were acquitted, however, as we will see later on. Nevertheless, the scale and persistence of the onslaught on Duffy indicates the chilling resolve of the drug barons to get him off what they saw as their domain. It was in April 1991 that 3 men from Blyth, about 10 miles north of Newcastle, were charged with the attempted murder of Duffy in relation to the shooting in January of that year. Raymond Palmer, Robert Charlton and Anthony Cole were from this Northumbrian town, well known for the drug dealing among its small population and for the high number of deaths from illegal drugs. Charges against Palmer and Charlton were later dropped. Cole was acquitted in October 1992 of the attempted murder of Duffy in a trial that heard that there was no real chance of securing a conviction. Birmingham has a connection with this story through the involvement of Marnon Clive Thomas and Leroy Vincent Fisher, both from that city, who were charged with robbing Duffy's girlfriend of a large quantity of jewellery shortly before Duffy was shot in the foot. A third man from Birmingham, John Leroy Thomas, was charged, along with Marnon Thomas and Leroy Fisher, with conspiring to murder Duffy on that same occasion. All 3 were charged within a few weeks of the shooting. John Leroy Thomas was given bail. The net was widening and 4 more people, all from Teesside, were pulled in and charged with conspiracy to murder. Sean Thomas Harrison, Paul James Bryan, Kevin James Beefy O'Keefe and Peter Corner. Then in April 1991, it was nearly a case of third time unlucky for Duffy when another attempt was made on his life. If shooting could not put paid to him, surely petrol would. In this incident, which had all the horror of a video nasty, Duffy was doused in petrol by a man who chased him with a lighter, according to Underworld sources. The commercial pub in South Bank was the scene of this attack in which Duffy reacted violently, breaking a man's jaw. For this retaliation, Duffy was charged with GBH, grievous bodily harm. Only a week before the assault in the commercial, in connection with another charge against Duffy, a judge in Chambers had freed him on bail with conditions that barred him from entering any licensed premises in Middlesbrough. On this occasion, Duffy had been remanded for GBH with intent on a man called Peter Wilson. It was alleged that he had offered Wilson £2,500 to drop the charges, and he was consequently charged with attempting to pervert the course of justice. A further charge of ABH, actual bodily harm, was brought against Duffy for an attack on Islam Ghoul, whom he had threatened to kill. There was a history of acquittals in cases involving attacks on Duffy. First, Patrick Tapping, who had been charged with attempting to murder him, was acquitted at his trial in May 1992. All 7 men charged with conspiracy to murder after the shooting of Duffy in January 1991 were eventually bailed. Conditions of bail were strict, but they had won their freedom. Subsequently, charges against all 7 were revised, with the result that they faced instead a lesser charge of conspiracy to commit GBH. At their trial in October 1992, all of them were acquitted. Meanwhile, the attacks on Duffy had gone on. In August 1991, on licensed premises in Middlesbrough, he was set upon by a group of men armed with baseball bats. With weapons ranging from iron bars and baseball bats to shotguns and petrol having been used against him, it can safely be assumed that Duffy was aware that people wanted to hurt him at the very least, and in doing so, they were no less violent than people were claiming he himself was. We have seen that there were a string of acquittals of people accused of crimes against him. One instance was the acquittal, in October 1992, of the 7 men charged with conspiring to cause him grievous bodily harm. You may recall that the charge against the 7 had been reduced from one of conspiracy to murder. Since it shines more light on Lee Duffy and the world that he moved in, let's look more closely at the trial of these men. John Leroy Thomas, 36, Leroy Vincent Fisher, 31, Marnon Clive Thomas, 31, Peter Corner, 23, Sean Thomas Harrison, 25, Paul James Bryan, 31, Kevin James O'Keefe, 32. The main prosecution witness, Ria Maria Nasir from Teesside. Nasir refused to give evidence against the 7 accused and was advised that she did not have to answer questions that might incriminate her. The prosecution, led by Andrew Robertson, told the jury that he was compelled to offer no evidence, and that Miss Nasir is the main prosecution witness, but her attitude shows her evidence isn't going to be forthcoming. The people who attempted to kill Duffy are cold, callous people. They kicked in the door of a woman who was 9 months pregnant and stuck the twin barrels of a sawn-off shotgun into her mouth in order to find out where Duffy was, and then they robbed her and her sister of jewellery. But it was a pregnant woman, not Lee Duffy, the Terminator of Teesside. No one was ever convicted of these crimes. Nasir gave an interview to the local press some 4 months later and said that she would persist with her lifestyle in spite of a series of alleged sinister attacks on her home. They say that hell hath no fury like a woman scorned. Ria Nasir put a great deal of emphasis on her family having been threatened, yet when Duffy's family and unborn child were traumatized, the court process could not help. The Crown's case was that a contract was put on Duffy because he was stepping on the toes of other people carrying out illegal acts. Duffy, with some of his followers, allegedly broke up a blues party, and the party organizer was told to give him the proceeds. This was the final straw that resulted in a contract on Duffy. In the event, the prosecution reviewed the evidence and decided not to proceed. All the defendants were found not guilty. After the trial collapsed, Lisa Stockel asked the then MP for Redcar and Cleveland, the late Mo Mowlam, to intervene, and all seemed well until about a week later, when Mowlam told Lisa that she could not get the paperwork released to her. Criminal injuries payments are meagre, but every little helps. Such payments for the loss of Lee Duffy were not pursued, Lisa was told, because legal aid would not be forthcoming since Lee had a criminal record. After Viv Graham, a top Underworld figure who had a criminal record comparable with Duffy's, was gunned down and murdered on Tyneside, criminal injuries payments were made on his behalf to one of Viv's 3 girlfriends, Anna Connolly. What was the difference? One of the reasons given as to why the prosecution did not call Lisa was that immediately after the robbery, she was asked if she would be able to recognize any of the men, and she gave an emphatic no. The other side of Duffy, the aggressor rather than the victim, is illustrated by the case brought against him for his attack on Peter Wilson in April 1991. The Wickersworld pub in Middlesbrough was the scene for this violent assault on the doorman. Wilson, a kickboxer well able to look after himself, was hit so hard that his neck was broken. Many believed that Duffy had used a beer can to smash the man with, but a private investigation revealed that it was his unaided fist that had inflicted the damage. The following is from a letter, dated Sunday, 2nd of June 1991, that Duffy wrote from HM Prison Durham. Now then, I thought I would write and tell you the crack of late. They've let me out of the block and back on the wing, so that's all right. I can get to the gym now and have a crack with the borough lads. People thought I was on protection, all kinds of stories flying about. Well, I'm here now, so anybody's got a chance to see me, I'm ready and willing. Everyone has been to my cell asking about me. 1 million, all right, Lee mates. Half of them were slagging me off when I was down the block. They make me sick, two-faced cunts. The idiot with the petrol is in here. I haven't seen him yet. If I chin him, I'll only end up in the block again. It can wait. Beefy, Paul and Nipper got bail. My judge in chambers was knocked back. 6! Bastards! I'm up at court on Wednesday 5th and Thursday 6th June. The Wickersworld assault is on Wednesday, and that the assault on Islam Ghoul is on Thursday. I should get the Ghoul assault thrown out, which automatically gives me another shot at bail. And reading between the lines, I think that Ghoul will sack it. We'll see, eh? I have just received the statements from the petrol assault charge. They aren't too clever either. Some woman says I punched the lad 10 times. And another one says I went over the top. What about me soaking in petrol, I hear you ask? Fucking right. How can you go over the top when someone's trying to kill you? Let's see what a judge and jury thinks. Not guilty. What sparked off the Wickersworld incident was that Duffy spilled some lager over a man on the landing below. Doorman Peter Wilson came over and started being funny with Lee, who punched him once. A third party was asked to see if Wilson would take a few £1,000s to drop the charges. Instead, he went straight to the police. In a similar scenario, Newcastle club doorman Howard Mills was offered money to drop charges against a man who had stabbed him in Bentley's nightclub in 1987. The stabbing occurred after Mills intervened when someone threw an empty beer can at a fellow doorman. Mills turned down an offer of financial compensation from the person who stabbed him, and it has been suggested that this refusal was the reason why he later had his leg blown off in a shotgun attack. As a result of Duffy's attack on Wilson, further charges of attempting to pervert the course of justice were fired off at him when he attempted to bribe his victim with £2,500. In all, Duffy had 9 court convictions to his credit, varying from burglary and motorbike theft to GBH. In April 1991, Duffy appeared in court for a bail application in relation to the Wickers World incident. Lisa went to lend him her support, but while she was walking up the stairs of the court building, she was confronted by the men charged with conspiring to commit grievous bodily harm to Duffy, who were apparently either attending or leaving court in connection with a pre-trial hearing. They mimicked being shot in the foot and sang a hurtful song to her. Lisa was so distressed that the police let her see Duffy while he was in the holding cells. And while the trial of the 7 men was waiting to go ahead, some of them were held on remand in the same prison as Duffy was held in for his attack on Peter Wilson. Duffy was put into solitary confinement while his alleged attackers were free to wander about the prison. It was in the interests of safety for all concerned, but for a man already imprisoned, isolation was a further punishment. No one disputes the fact that Duffy taxed drug dealers and frightened the living daylights out of them. But if you had the misfortune to have drug dealers living in your street and the police weren't doing anything about it, wouldn't you want an enforcer like him taxing them and keeping an eye on them? Lee once looked after Brian Charrington, the international drug dealer, whilst they were inside prison. When Lee got out, Brian gave Lee a $7,000 Rolex as a thank you. It is true Lee stopped a lot of people in Middlesbrough selling drugs, and people were then having to go to places like Manchester just to get them. Lee didn't really capitalise on the void by selling the stuff himself, as I'm told that Lee couldn't run a bath. When Lee did have big bags of ecstasy, he would eat most of them himself, sometimes being on them for days on end in Newcastle and other places he would flee to live the party lifestyle he so loved. Sometimes Lee would get by on 2 hours sleep a night because he was partying that much. One of Lee's close friends told me that a book could have been written about each day in Lee's life as he was up to that much. In fact, one of Lee's favourite sayings was, "You can put this in a book when I'm gone." Lee spoke all the time about his death, and he had an instinct that he wouldn't make old bones. Anyone close to Lee will know that. He predicted also that one day someone would write a book on him. There have been several books touching on his life whilst writing about other people, so I suppose this is the only one that is solely about Lee. But I hope this one will be the most balanced one. Another time, Lee offered his best friend a huge amount of money just so he would stay out with him another night, after they'd been out 2 days already smoking dope up Eston Hills. I asked one of his closest friends what Lee was like as a kid, to which his reply was, "Lee Duffy was never a kid. Even at 15, he was like a man." On one side of Lee, you've got this big monster of a man who looked the part and was capable of battering people. Then on the other hand, you've got this big, cumbersome kid who was still childlike and still very damaged from the abuse he suffered years before. It is true that when Lee was in prison, he would seek out the hardest in the place and want to take over. In Walton Prison, Lee went on the exercise yard and demanded to know who the top man was. I have it on good authority that the Scousers were petrified of him, and Lee was even more violent inside prison because there were no weapons inside or any risk of him being shot. Even men in their gangs didn't want to tackle the Duff, and I'll quote my source, "He knocked them all dead as a nit." Lee was an extra bad lad in jail. Not many people realise that Lee and Davy Allo did time together in Walton Prison, and after Davy got out he even ran Lee's girlfriend back on a visit. Yes, Lee and Allo had been friends, as much as you could be friends with Lee, as I have been told that even if he classed you as a friend, you still had to be on your guard with him. Allo got on with Lee at times, that is true, but I've been told that the bad blood started because he wouldn't bow to Lee, and Lee wasn't having that. It's well known in Middlesbrough that Allo was a staunch man who would have a do with anyone. The fact was, Lee and Allo came to blows on 3 separate occasions. Once in the Blazes foyer, whilst scuffling, it is said that Allo was seen to be getting the better of him as they had fallen, and Allo had landed on top of Lee. Then, at the law courts, Lee had been in a car with a friend and saw Allo and told his mate to pull over and asked him to watch his back, as Allo was with a couple of mates drinking. Lee approached Allo and said, "I hear you've been looking for me." And from there it quickly escalated into them trading blows, Lee getting the better of Allo that time. Then the last time, well, everyone knows how that ended. The real bad feeling between the two really started at John Graham's wedding, just a couple of months before their last confrontation outside the Western and Afro-Caribbean Centre on Martin Road. I've been told one of Lee's party tricks was to let the people whose company he was in drink fast while Lee poured his drinks out. Brian Jaffray caught Lee doing that a few times, spitting his drinks out on the pub carpet. People close to Lee have told me that Lee never used to relax. He never sat down and watched the TV and switched off from the outside world. He lived his life at 100 miles per hour every single day. Another thing Lee wouldn't do is sleep in the same house for more than one consecutive night. He would regularly sleep at different houses all over Middlesbrough. One guy who was close to Lee said that he often said his ambition in life was to kill a man with his bare hands by the time he was 30 years old. The same source told me that Lee used to say that by the time they were 30, Joe Livingstone, David Allison, or himself would be dead. The prisons couldn't contain him, and that's why he ended up in 22 different prisons during the 26 months of the 4-year sentence he served, because they'd move him along to try and break his spirit. That would only normally happen to AA cats, but they put Lee on what they called the circuit just to basically wind him in, even though he was only ever Cat B at worst. That's what got him his notoriety in the British prison system. I was told that if Lee Duffy was still here today, he'd be the exact same person he was back in 1991. He didn't want to change. He was happy being a gangster. He'd have only become bigger, stronger, and deadlier. On the other hand, he might have been a more settled family man, popping out for a pint to his local on a Sunday afternoon, reminiscing about the crazy things he used to get up to and shaking his head, but we will never know for sure. In one of the many stories told about Duffy, a large van pulled up outside the Empire pub in Middlesbrough with about 30 mountain bikes in it, and the driver got out and asked him if he or his mate knew where Bobby's Cycles was. Duffy told the driver that they didn't, but said, "They'll know in there," and pointed to the pub. When the driver, leaving the engine running, went into the pub, 2 men hanging about nearby, who had nothing to do with Duffy and his mate, jumped smartly into the van and drove off at high speed. At that time, a good mountain bike would fetch about £500. That very night, Duffy's friend went to see his mother, who said to him, "Have you heard about your mate, Duffy?" A man pulls up from the handicapped kids' place with a load of bikes asking for directions. Lee Duffy knocked him out, broke his cheekbone, and took all the bikes off him that were for the kids. Tales like this helped build the wrong kind of reputation for Duffy. But then powerful characters always attract exaggeration. But many believe it is no exaggeration to say that Duffy had such a presence that he could go into a nightclub containing 1,000 people, and within 10 minutes there would only be 100 left in the place. He would not need to hit anyone with his fists. His fearsome aura was enough. When Duffy was in jail, his girlfriend and his friend visited him, and when they eventually got in to see him, he was walking around alone in a big caged yard. Why, you might wonder. The answer: 18 people in that prison wanted to murder him. To the prison authorities, it was easier to ensure his safety by locking him up in secure surroundings, rather than putting him in with a mob of would-be assassins. Another story of Duffy's time behind bars also shows his forceful character. As he was brought out of a door from a little tunnel, he had one joint in his mouth and another one tucked behind his ear. Puffing vigorously on the joint, he seemed oblivious to the prison officer on either side of him. The screws escorted him into a little room hastily assembled as a makeshift visiting area. "Fuck off!" he said to them. "Lee, on a visit, we've got to stand over you," they explained. To this he shot back, "Look, you've got me out of the cell, but you've got to get me back in the cell. Foff!" The two screws walked briskly out of the room, in no mood to argue with this particular prisoner. Another time, Duffy's friend Neil Booth decided to climb on to the roof of the Havana nightclub. Off his head with drink, he started to throw roofing tiles onto the street below. Duffy, unaware of this, was in a house around the corner, and the police went there to ask him to get Booth down off the roof. Now then was Duffy's way of saying, "I'm here." Sure, he had no need to make such grand entrances, but that is how Duffy was. When it came to being involved in running things on Teesside, he could not be bothered with menial issues, but making a grand entrance was always important to him. After Duffy was shot the second time and was hospitalized for a few days, he would smoke dope to help him overcome the pain. "Come here. Do you want a go of this?" he would say to his armed police guard as he held out a joint mockingly. Yet Duffy was also a sensitive man, and an extract from a letter he wrote to Lisa Stockel reveals this side of him. Here was a man who had had half his foot shot off in an assassination attempt, and his skull beaten with a crowbar. And yet all he speaks of in this letter, written on one side of a greetings card, is the pain and suffering his girlfriend must have gone through when she went into hospital to have their daughter Catty Lee, obviously without his being able to witness the birth. Not once does he fall into self-pity for his own predicament. The neat handwriting points to someone who is methodical and artistic. Some of the text slopes down from right to left, an indication he was depressed. The neatness of the hand leads me to believe he was a bit of a perfectionist, and it's well known that perfectionists can become frustrated. Maybe this helps explain why Duffy would sometimes fly off the handle. But despite these outbursts, he was also someone who thought a lot. It's clear that his chosen lifestyle also brought with it a degree of paranoia, though maybe this was just a state of heightened vigilance. Anyway, one day Duffy was on his way to a blues party and became paranoid, thinking the people that had previously shot him were there. He drove to a house in Stockton, went in, and within minutes returned to the car carrying 3 guns. To one of his associates he said, "Here, get one of them." "Few with your get one of them," the man replied. "I don't mind having a fight with someone, but if I get caught with this and you shoot someone, the frame of mind you're in, I'm getting 15 years here." Lee once said his favourite line was from a Waterboys song, "Too Far, Too Soon." In 1991, that line became prophecy. That summer, his past caught up with him. Lee Duffy was stabbed to death during a violent confrontation. He was just 26 years old. Even now, decades later, his name still echoes through Teesside streets. Some revere him, others fear him, but all agree his story is a warning. Lee Duffy lived fast, fought hard, and paid the ultimate price. His story is not just one of violence, but of choices, and the lesson is still there, waiting to be learned.